World War II left more than 70 million dead military archives classified for decades, and a surprising number of episodes that, 8 decades after the conflict ended, retain dark areas impossible to close entirely. Generals who disappeared without leaving a trace, treasures that were lost amid the chaos of defeat, weapons that perhaps never existed outside a misinterpreted report, and military decisions that still generate academic controversy, make up a parallel map of the conflict, one that official documentation, despite decades of declassifications, never managed to complete. Some of these episodes were partially resolved thanks to archives that came to light long after 1945. Others remain exactly where the end of the war left them, in uncertainty. The following 25 stories span continents and distinct categories. High-ranking figures who vanished without leaving a body or a closed file, shipments of gold and jewels that the chaos of defeat scattered through mines, tunnels and seabeds, scientific programs and weapons that oscillate between real secrecy and fabricated legend, and military decisions whose ultimate reasons the available documentation never fully managed to explain precisely. Together they form an inventory of the blind spots that even the most exhaustive historical archive on the war has not managed to cover completely. The final flight of Glenn Miller. On December 15, 1944, Major Glenn Miller, director of the band of the United States Army Air Forces and one of the most popular musical figures of his time, boarded a small Nordun Norseman aircraft at the Twinwood Farm Base, Bedfordshire, bound for Paris. There he was to prepare a Christmas concert for the Allied troops that had just liberated the city. Accompanying him were the pilot, Lieutenant John R.S. Morgan, and Lieutenant Colonel Norman Basel. The plane took off under adverse weather, with dense fog over the English Channel, and never reached its destination. Neither the aircraft nor the bodies of its 3 occupants were ever found. The official investigation could not establish a definitive cause. One of the most sustained hypotheses indicates that the Norseman, equipped with a carburetor prone to icing in conditions of extreme humidity and cold, simply fell into the sea due to a mechanical failure known in that model of aircraft. Another theory, defended by British veteran Fred Shaw in the 1990s, maintains that a group of RAF Lancaster bombers, returning from an aborted mission over Siegen, dropped their explosive load over a designated area of the channel to lighten weight before landing, just at the time and place where Miller's plane is estimated to have been flying. Later researchers recalculated the coordinates and concluded that the time slot did not coincide with total precision, which left the hypothesis neither confirmed nor definitively ruled out. Over the decades, less supported versions also emerged, from an alleged forced landing in occupied France to rumors that Miller had died in a Parisian brothel and that his death had been covered up for reasons of military decorum, a story without any documentary support. Fishermen and underwater searchers have reported at different times wreckage compatible with a Norseman on the Channel seabed, but none was conclusively identified as Miller's plane by serial number or other material evidence. The United States Army also decided not to inform the press of the disappearance until several weeks later, in the midst of the Battle of the Bulge, so as not to affect troop morale. That delay fed, from the very beginning, the versions suggesting something more than an accident. 80 years later, neither the plane nor the remains of Miller, Morgan or Basel have been recovered, and the English Channel remains officially their tomb. In 2014, historian Dennis Spragg, after gaining access to complete RAF operational records, located with greater precision the exact area where the Lancasters dropped their bombs that night, several kilometers from the most probable route of Miller's Norseman, which weakened the friendly fire theory without eliminating it entirely. No subsequent claim of finding wreckage on the Channel seabed, including those presented by private divers in different decades, was officially validated by the British Ministry of Defence, which continues to classify the case as an operational loss with unknown whereabouts. The strange journey of Rudolf Hess to Scotland. On May 10, 1941, Rudolf Hess, number 3 in the hierarchy of the Nazi regime and Hitler's designated successor after Hermann Göring, took off alone from Augsburg at the controls of a Messerschmitt Bf 110 twin-engine fighter modified with additional fuel tanks. He flew more than 1,500 kilometers to Scotland, where he finally parachuted near Eaglesham, a few kilometers from the residence of the Duke of Hamilton. His declared objective was to negotiate a separate peace with Great Britain, based on the idea that both Germanic nations should unite against the Soviet Union, whose invasion Germany would launch barely 6 weeks later. The operation was kept in absolute secrecy even within the German regime itself. Hitler, informed after the flight, reacted with what his collaborators described as genuine shock, and ordered the version to be spread that Hess had acted on his own initiative, possibly affected by mental imbalances, a narrative that suited both sides. Germany in order to distance itself from the episode, and Great Britain in order to avoid it being interpreted as a sign of weakness in the face of a real peace proposal. What was never fully clarified is to what extent the Duke of Hamilton, an RAF pilot, and a figure with a certain prior sympathy toward Anglo-German rapprochement, was expecting the contact, and whether British intelligence services participated in luring Hess through intermediaries. Some historians maintain that MI6 organized a deception operation using a double agent to make Hess believe that there was a British aristocratic group willing to negotiate, thus taking advantage of his good faith to neutralize him politically. Others consider that Hess acted motivated solely by his own reading of the situation, influenced by the occultism and astrology he professed, without any kind of trap involved. Documents related to the case remained classified in the British National Archives much longer than most files from the period, which fueled suspicions about their content. When they were finally partially declassified in the 90s and 2000s, they did not provide a definitive answer regarding the degree of prior coordination. Hess remained imprisoned for the rest of his life, was tried at Nuremberg and sentenced to life imprisonment, and died in Spandau prison in 1987. To this day, the exact motives for his flight, the real role of the British intelligence services, and the knowledge Hitler had of the plan remain without a unanimous historical version. His wife, Ilse Hess, led an international campaign for decades to secure his release on humanitarian grounds, supported even by Western governments toward the end of his life. The Soviet Union, however, systematically vetoed every attempt at release within the Committee of the Four Powers that administered Spandau, arguing that Hess had to serve the entirety of his sentence, a stance that some historians interpret as a late form of political retaliation rather than as a strictly grounded legal decision. Hitler's death, the body that never fully convinced. On April 30th, 1945, with the Red Army a few blocks from the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, whom he had married a day earlier, died in the underground bunker in Berlin. According to the witnesses who survived, Hitler shot himself with his pistol while biting a cyanide capsule, and Braun ingested poison. The bodies were taken to the Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline and partially burned by Hitler's express order, as he feared that his corpse would be displayed as a Soviet trophy in the style of Mussolini a few days earlier. Soviet Smersh troops, the military counterintelligence, found the charred remains days later and subjected them to a secret autopsy. The identification was based mainly on the testimony of Käthe Häusermann, assistant to Hitler's dentist, and on dental X-rays that matched very particular bridges and fillings. The Soviet Union, however, did not publicly confirm Hitler's death for years, and Stalin even suggested to the Western Allies that the dictator might have escaped, a deliberate ambiguity that sought to sow doubts and prevent him from being turned into a martyr among his followers. The remains stayed under Soviet custody in different locations in East Germany until 1970, when, according to KGB documents declassified in 1990, they were exhumed, completely incinerated, and their ashes thrown into a tributary of the Elbe River to prevent the place from becoming a neo-Nazi cult site. However, a skull fragment with a bullet hole and a portion of jaw with teeth remained preserved in the Russian state archives. In 2009, a team from the University of Connecticut obtained a sample from the skull fragment and, upon analyzing its DNA, determined that it belonged to a woman between 20 and 40 years old, which reopened the discussion about the authenticity of the pieces displayed by Moscow for decades. The controversy continued until 2018, when a forensic team led by the French doctor Philippe Charlier gained access to the teeth preserved in the Russian archives and, after comparing them with the original dental records and X-rays from 1945, concluded with a high degree of scientific certainty that they corresponded to Hitler, thus ruling out the possibility of an escape. Despite this conclusion, popular theories about a flight to South America, fueled by books without documentary support published since the 1960s, continue to circulate, sustained more by cultural fascination than by verifiable historical evidence. Parallel to the escape theories, different FBI and Argentine intelligence archives declassified in recent years generated periodic waves of headlines about an alleged Hitler refuge in Patagonia, none supported by forensic evidence comparable to the dentition analyzed in 2018. Stalin's own initial ambiguity, added to the final destruction of the remains in 1970, guaranteed that the question would survive longer than the available evidence should have allowed. Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo chief who vanished. Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo and directly responsible for coordinating the deportations to the extermination camps, was last seen with certainty on the night of May 1, 1945, inside the Chancellery bunker while discussing with other officers the possibility of attempting a rapprochement with the Soviets. From that moment on, his trail is lost completely. Unlike Bormann or Hitler, whose fate became clear over time, Müller's was never confirmed by any authority. In 1963, West Berlin authorities exhumed a grave in the Mitte Jewish cemetery that bore his name, originally identified in 1945 from a corpse found near the bunker. The bone analysis determined that the grave actually contained the remains of 3 different people, none of them corresponding to Müller, which invalidated the only physical evidence that had been attributed to him until then. Since then, Western intelligence services intermittently investigated dozens of leads. Testimonies that placed him living in South America under a false identity, CIA documents declassified in the 2000s that mentioned unconfirmed reports about a possible recruitment by Czechoslovak or even Soviet intelligence after the war, and persistent rumors that he had died in Berlin during the final fighting and was buried anonymously in an unidentified mass grave. None of these lines produced conclusive proof. The Simon Wiesenthal Center and different agencies searching for war criminals kept his case open for decades, without result. Unlike other high-ranking Nazi officials who were tried, captured, or whose body was identified through DNA testing, as finally happened with Martin Bormann in 1998 or with Josef Mengele in 1992, Müller represents one of the few cases in which there is not even historical consensus on whether he died in 1945 or survived several more years somewhere. His personal file in the Gestapo, unlike those of many of his subordinates, was also not recovered complete, which deprived investigators of a direct source to reconstruct both his career and his possible final fate. Müller had also been one of the key pieces in the logistical organization of the Wannsee Conference of 1942 and in the administrative coordination of the deportations to the camps in the East, which made his search a particular priority for post-war war criminal hunters. Soviet documents partially declassified after the fall of the USSR mention an officer with a similar surname recruited by Eastern European intelligence services, but no historian managed to establish a reliable identification between that person and the chief of the Gestapo. Unlike Adolf Eichmann, captured by Israeli agents in Argentina in 1960 after years of surveillance, or Klaus Barbie, extradited from Bolivia in 1983, the Müller case never produced either a capture or a forensic confirmation of his death, which turned him into one of the few top-level Nazi hierarchs whose international police file formally continues to remain open. The prisoner of Spandau, was he really Rudolf Hess? After his capture in 1941 and his sentence to life imprisonment at the Nuremberg trials, Rudolf Hess spent more than 4 decades as the sole inmate of Spandau prison in Berlin, jointly guarded by the 4 occupying powers. On August 17, 1987, at the age of 93, he was found dead in a hut in the prison garden, apparently strangled with an electrical cord tied to the window. The authorities concluded that it was a suicide, although his family and several researchers questioned that version, pointing out that a man of his age and reduced mobility could hardly have caused his own death in that way without the assistance of third parties. At the same time, since the 1970s, a different and more extreme theory had circulated, that the man imprisoned in Spandau throughout all those years was not really Rudolf Hess, but a double sent by German or British intelligence while the real Hess had died or remained hidden somewhere else. The hypothesis was supported by specific medical findings, such as the absence of scars from war wounds that Hess had suffered during the First World War, documented in medical records prior to 1941, and in discrepancies pointed out by some British military doctors who examined him during his captivity in Spandau. The controversy was strongly revived in 1973 when a British military surgeon, after reviewing X-rays of the prisoner, publicly declared that he did not find the marks of the bullet wounds in the chest that the real Hess should have retained according to pre-war medical records. The British Ministry of Defence always defended the authenticity of the prisoner, and genetic and anthropometric analyses carried out after his death, comparing dental records and archival cranial measurements, largely supported that he was indeed Hess. However, part of the complete medical documentation of his examinations during captivity was never fully published, which to this day sustains a small but persistent group of historians and former military personnel who defend the theory of the double. The Spandau case thus combines two overlapping mysteries: the real identity of the prisoner and the true cause of his death, neither closed with the unanimity that usually accompanies other post-war files already settled by historiography. The shared custody regime itself, in which the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom and France took monthly turns guarding a single prisoner, was in itself a considerable logistical cost for more than 40 years, which led several Western officials to privately question why Moscow insisted on maintaining such an onerous arrangement to retain a single elderly man, further fueling suspicions about the true Soviet interests behind the case. The disappearance of Raoul Wallenberg. Between July 1944 and January 1945, the Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, assigned to his country's legation in Budapest, used his position to issue thousands of protective passports, the so-called Schutzpässe, which allowed Hungarian Jews to avoid deportation to extermination camps, as well as organizing shelters and negotiating directly with Nazi and Hungarian officers to stop mass executions. He is credited with having saved, according to different academic estimates, between 10,000 and 100,000 lives, which made him one of the most recognized humanitarian figures of the Holocaust. On January 17, 1945, shortly after the arrival of the Red Army in Budapest, Wallenberg was arrested by Soviet forces on suspicion of espionage, possibly because of his contacts with Western intelligence services during the war, and transferred to Moscow. From that moment on, his documentary trail becomes scarce and contradictory. The Soviet Union denied for years having any information about him, until in 1957 it admitted that Wallenberg had died in Lubyanka prison on July 17, 1947, allegedly of a heart attack, according to a report signed by the prison's chief physician. Joint Swedish-Russian investigations carried out in the 90s and 2000s after partial access to Soviet archives found inconsistencies in that version. The medical report lacked support in other hospital records from the period, and witnesses who shared captivity with Wallenberg at different moments after 1947 declared having seen or heard of a prisoner who matched his description in the following years, even up to the 1960s. None of those testimonies could be independently confirmed, and the KGB archives related to his case, far from clarifying the picture, showed incomplete or directly absent records for specific periods of his captivity. The Joint Commission concluded in 2001 without being able to establish with certainty either the real date of his death or the exact circumstances, officially leaving open the possibility that Wallenberg had survived in the Soviet prison system beyond what Moscow declared. Russia keeps part of the documentation related to foreign prisoners from that period classified, which prevents, to this day, definitively closing one of the most studied cases of post-war disappearances. In 2016, the Russian government formally recognized Wallenberg as a victim of Soviet political repression, a symbolic gesture that also clarified neither the exact date nor the place of his death. Streets, squares, and monuments in Budapest, Stockholm, and Buenos Aires bear his name today, while archives after 1947 that could contain additional references to his whereabouts remain, according to Swedish diplomats, not fully declassified within the Russian security services. Yamashita's gold. During the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia, imperial forces systematically looted banks, temples, museums, and private residences in the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma, and other conquered territories in an operation known unofficially as Golden Lily. According to the legend that emerged after the war, much of that loot, composed of gold, precious stones, and works of art, would have been concentrated in the Philippines and hidden in a network of tunnels and caves under the supervision of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, Japanese commander in the archipelago, shortly before the surrender of 1945. Yamashita was captured, tried for war crimes, and executed in 1946 without being formally attributed knowledge of or direct participation in the concealment of any treasure during his trial. However, the legend gained strength of its own in the following decades, fueled by accounts from treasure hunters, retired Japanese officers, and, above all, by the court case of Rogelio Roxas, a Filipino locksmith who in 1971 claimed to have found, together with a group of excavators, a tunnel with a golden Buddha statue and gold bars near Baguio. Roxas denounced that the Philippine authorities, linked to then-President Ferdinand Marcos, confiscated the find from him. Decades later, after Roxas had died, a Hawaiian court ruled in favor of his heirs, granting them a multi-million-dollar compensation for the dispossession, although without this implying a judicial confirmation of the existence or final fate of the gold. Historians specialized in the Japanese occupation based on declassified Japanese military archives consider it unlikely that a treasure of the dimensions described by popular folklore existed as a single mass hidden in one single point, given that the Japanese looting was distributed and, in part, documented as regular remittances to Tokyo throughout the war. Despite that academic skepticism, the Philippines continues to grant official treasure search permits under this name, and the Yamashita myth continues to motivate expeditions, books, and documentaries without the discovery of a quantity of gold comparable to that described by popular legend ever having been officially verified. The historian Sterling Seagrave, author of one of the most widely circulated books on the subject, maintained that part of the looted gold would eventually have been used to finance secret political funds in the Philippines during the post-war period, a claim that lacked verifiable banking documentation and was rejected by much of the academic historiography specialized in the Japanese occupation. The Philippine government continues, nevertheless, to receive annual requests for excavation permits protected under the legend. The Amber Room. The Amber Room was a chamber of panels carved in amber, gold, and semi-precious stones, given in 1716 by the Prussian King Frederick William I to Tsar Peter the Great, and finally installed in the Catherine Palace near Leningrad, where it was considered for centuries one of the most valuable works of decorative art in Europe. In 1941, after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Nazi officers dismantled the entire room in less than 36 hours and moved it to Königsberg in East Prussia, where it was exhibited in the city castle until 1944. When the Red Army advanced on Königsberg at the beginning of 1945, the castle suffered Allied bombings and later intense ground fighting during the Soviet capture of the city. From that moment on, the documented trail of the Amber Room was lost. The most accepted version among historians maintains that the pieces, stored in crates inside the castle, were destroyed by the fire that consumed the building in April 1945. Another current maintains that the Germans managed to evacuate at least part of the room before the fall of the city, and that it remains hidden in some bunker, mine, or wreck not yet located in the Baltic region. During the Cold War, both Soviet and German authorities organized official searches without result, and numerous amateur treasure hunters claimed to have found clues in mines in Poland, basements in Kaliningrad, the present-day Königsberg, or even at the bottom of nearby lakes, none confirmed with expert rigor. In 1997, German authorities recovered a stone mosaic that was an original part of the room in the hands of a former combatant who had taken it as personal loot. which demonstrated that at least some loose pieces survived outside the castle fire without resolving the fate of the complete ensemble. Between 1979 and 2003, Russian craftsmen reconstructed the room from scratch using black and white archival photographs and preserved amber samples, today exhibited again in the Catherine Palace, while the original still has not reappeared in any of the searches carried out up to the present. In 2020, a group of German researchers resumed the search in an abandoned quarry near Deutschneudorf in Saxony after the discovery of a map attributed to an SS officer, without the drillings carried out confirming any finding related to the original room. Each new clue, recurring since the 1950s, has followed the same pattern: initial media expectation followed by a negative result, without that having managed so far to discourage new expeditions. Some art historians maintain that, given the almost priceless value of the room, its total destruction by fire is less likely than was assumed for decades, and that it is more reasonable to suppose that at least significant fragments were removed from Königsberg before its final fall, later dispersed among private collectors who, aware of their stolen origin, never declared them publicly. The Wałbrzych Gold Train. In 2015, two treasure hunters, the Pole Piotr Koper and the German Andreas Richter, publicly announced that they had located by means of ground-penetrating radar an underground object approximately 100 meters long near a stretch of abandoned tracks close to Książ Castle in Wałbrzych, southwestern Poland. According to their interpretation, it was a German armored train hidden in a sealed tunnel during the final months of the war, possibly loaded with looted gold, jewels, and works of art, linked to the local legend of a convoy that disappeared in the chaotic days of the German retreat from Silesia in 1945. The announcement coincided with an old oral tradition of the region, which since the post-war period spoke of a ghost train hidden in one of the numerous tunnels of Project Ries, an underground complex built with forced labor under the nearby mountains for purposes still debated by historians, ranging from command bunkers to secret industrial facilities linked to the German armaments program. The news generated considerable international expectation and led the Polish authorities, together with a team of geologists and the armed forces, to carry out official excavations in 2016. The drilling and subsequent geophysical studies found no artificial tunnel or railway structure at the indicated point. The Polish government concluded that the anomaly detected by the radar probably corresponded to a natural geological formation and officially closed the investigation without any find. Koper and Richter maintained, despite the results, that their original measurements were correct and that the excavated point did not exactly coincide with the one they had initially indicated. The legend of the Wałbrzych gold train, documented since the 50s in accounts by miners and soldiers from the area, continues without verification, and the extensive tunnel system of Project Rise, only partially explored to this day due to collapses and the lack of complete plans, continues to fuel new search expeditions in the region every few years. The episode, despite the negative result of the official excavations, multiplied tourism in Wałbrzych and revalued interest in Project Ries as a destination for guided tours, generating a curious positive economic effect from a find that ultimately did not exist. Polish researchers continue, nevertheless, to document new sections of the underground complex every year, without any of them having so far yielded material compatible with a complete railway convoy. The very name of Project Ries still lacks a definitive translation of purpose among historians. While some link it to the manufacture of components for advanced rocketry programs, others associate it with air raid shelters for the regional high command, and the lack of complete architectural plans, many deliberately destroyed before the German retreat from Silesia, prevents to this day resolving with certainty what its main function was beyond the legend of the train. The Reichsbank gold that was never fully accounted for. On April 4, 1945, American soldiers of the 90th Infantry Division discovered, in a salt mine near the town of Merkers in Thuringia, one of the greatest finds of the war, around 100 tons of Reichsbank gold, along with foreign currency, paintings and objects requisitioned from victims of the Holocaust, including gold dental pieces and personal jewelry. General Eisenhower personally visited the site in one of the most widely circulated images of the post-war period, and the contents were transferred to Frankfurt under strict military custody. However, the economic historians who later reconstructed the Reichsbank's accounting from German banking records pointed out that the quantity recovered at Merkers did not represent the entirety of the gold reserves that Germany possessed at the beginning of the war, nor of the assets it continued to accumulate through the looting of occupied countries and the confiscation of Jewish property. A significant part of the central bank's gold and foreign currency had been distributed in the final months of the conflict among different regional offices, neutral embassies, and SS officers in evacuation operations toward areas considered safer, including possible shipments to Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, and South America, through banking and diplomatic networks that remained partially active until the final collapse of the regime. Post-war investigations carried out by Allied commissions and reopened decades later by Swiss historians in the 1990s within the framework of claims over funds belonging to Holocaust victims deposited in neutral banks, managed to trace only a fraction of those movements, documenting transfers to the Swiss National Bank whose origin and final destination in some cases could not be reconstructed with complete accounting precision. The German government itself acknowledged in later reports that a portion of the Reichsbank's gold, estimated at different figures depending on the source consulted, was never recovered or definitively accounted for, which keeps open to this day the question of its exact destination and of how many of those remittances actually reached their declared destination. The so-called Operation Safe Haven, organized by the Western Allies toward the end of the war, attempted precisely to track these movements of capital toward neutral countries, but its scope was limited by the lack of full cooperation from Swiss, Spanish, and Portuguese banks, and by the priority that the Western powers gave already in 1945 to rebuilding Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union, rather than to exhaustively pursuing every gold bar diverted during the collapse of the regime. The submarine. I-52 and the gold at the bottom of the Pacific. Within the framework of the so-called Yanagi missions, through which Japan and Germany exchanged military technology and strategic raw materials during the war, the Japanese cargo submarine I-52 sailed from Kobe in March 1944, bound for the French port of Lorient, occupied by German forces. It carried, among other materials, tin, rubber, quinine, opium, and approximately 2 tons of gold distributed in 146 ingots intended to pay Germany for military equipment, including radar plans, sonar plans, and possibly components for a jet aircraft. Thanks to Allied signals intelligence, which had partially deciphered Japanese naval communications, the United States Navy knew the submarine's route in advance. On June 23, 1944, a torpedo bomber launched from the escort carrier USS Bogue located the I-52 in the middle of the Atlantic, about 1,600 kilometers west of the Cape Verde Islands, and sank it with an acoustically guided torpedo, one of the first weapons of that type successfully used in naval combat. The 85 Japanese crew members died along with a German liaison officer who was traveling aboard as a technical observer. The submarine remained lost until 1995, when the American treasure hunter Paul Tidwell, after years of research in declassified naval archives, located the wreck at a depth of 5,200 meters, one of the deepest wreck explorations carried out until then with civilian technology. Subsequent expeditions with remotely operated vehicles confirmed the presence of boxes and containers compatible with the declared cargo, and even recovered some ingot samples for laboratory analysis. But the complete extraction of the gold never materialized, partly because of legal disputes over the ownership of the cargo among the Japanese government, the American government, and Tidwell's company, and partly because of the extraordinary costs involved in operating sustainably at that depth. Most of the I-52's gold, according to the explorers who located it themselves, still remains at the bottom of the Atlantic. The Japanese government maintained for years that the cargo, as it was a warship sunk in combat, had to be considered under sovereign immunity, which complicated any attempt at commercial recovery by Tidwell's company. A 1998 expedition with a crewed submersible again confirmed the relative integrity of the hull at that depth, but the costs of a large-scale extraction, estimated at several tens of millions of dollars, have stopped any definitive rescue operation to this day. The sinking of the Awamaru. The Awamaru was a Japanese passenger and cargo ship to which, in an exceptional case within the law of war, the United States granted a guarantee of safe passage in March 1945 in exchange for its transporting Red Cross supplies intended for Allied prisoners held in Southeast Asia. The agreement, communicated through diplomatic channels via Switzerland, included the obligation that the ship sail with its lights on during the night and display distinctive markings to avoid being confused with a legitimate military target. In the early hours of April 1, 1945, while crossing the Taiwan Strait on its return to Japan, the Awamaru was sighted by the American submarine USS Queenfish, whose commander, Charles Elliott Laughlin, mistakenly identified the vessel as an enemy destroyer due to the fog and failures in internal communication about the safe conduct in force for that route and that date. The Queenfish fired 4 torpedoes that sank the Awamaru in minutes, killing more than 2,000 people, including crew members, civilian passengers, and Allied prisoners of war who were traveling on board in the opposite direction to that officially declared by Tokyo. Only one survivor was rescued. Laughlin faced a court-martial for the violation of the Safe Passage Agreement, although he was lightly sanctioned and continued his naval career without major consequences. Beyond the human tragedy, the sinking fueled rumors for decades about an additional cargo not declared in the official manifest: gold, platinum, industrial diamonds, and works of art looted in occupied territories, which Japan had allegedly attempted to repatriate by taking advantage of the convoy's immunity. China, which claimed part of the wreckage because it was located in what it considered its waters, organized salvage operations between 1977 and 1980, that recovered rubber, tin, and a quantity of valuables never detailed with precision in available public sources. Post-war Japanese documents partially destroyed during the surrender did not allow a complete inventory of the Awamaru's real cargo to be reconstructed, leaving without definitive confirmation both the total contents of the ship and the final destination of what was recovered by Chinese divers in those campaigns of the 1970s. The United States Department of State itself had warned the Navy through an encrypted message that reached the submarine with delays about the presence of the protected convoy on that exact route, a communication failure that different naval historians consider the central administrative cause of the tragedy, beyond the visual identification error committed by Laughlin on that foggy night. The case was also documented as one of the few examples of the Pacific War in which the United States formally acknowledged having violated a protection agreement that it had granted in writing. Rommel's lost gold. In 1948, the French magazine Noir et Blanc published a series of articles signed by the journalist Robert Ferrier that recounted the discovery of a map supposedly drawn by a German non-commissioned officer before dying, which indicated the location of a treasure hidden by troops of the Afrika Korps under the command of Marshal Erwin Rommel. According to the account, before the German retreat from North Africa in 1943, officers had supposedly buried in caves in Corsica or somewhere on the Tunisian coast a shipment of jewels, gold, and currencies looted during the campaign, transported in a submarine that never reached its destination. The story was an immediate success and unleashed a wave of private expeditions to Corsica during the 50s and 60s, financed even by foreign businessmen and adventurers, without any of them managing to find a trace of the supposed treasure. In 1953, Ferrier himself publicly acknowledged in another publication that the whole story had been an invention of his to increase the magazine's sales, including the map, presented as a graphic document prepared by himself without any real basis or true testimony behind it. Despite that confession, widely circulated at the time within French journalistic circles, the myth of Rommel's gold survived and mutated over time, feeding new versions that no longer attributed the origin of the story to Ferrier, but instead presented it as a genuine historical fact poorly denied by hidden interests. Documentaries, books, and at least one film production took up the legend again in later decades, often presenting it without mentioning its origin as a deliberate journalistic invention. Treasure hunters continued exploring coastal caves in Corsica well into the 21st century, and the combination of a denial little circulated outside France with the narrative appeal of a legendary marshal and a war treasure kept alive a story that, unlike other mysteries on this list, was born as an acknowledged fiction and yet never fully disappeared from the popular imagination about the war in the desert. The persistence of the myth proved so strong that it even inspired years later plots for adventure novels and at least one film script centered on the search for a Nazi treasure in the Mediterranean, a genre that continued producing similar accounts long after Ferrière's own confession had been documented in publicly accessible French journalistic archives. Teams with modern metal detectors once again toured the Corsican coasts in the 2000s, attracted again by local accounts that, despite the original denial, continued to be transmitted from generation to generation among the island's inhabitants. Operation Vegetarian. Between 1942 and 1944, scientists at the British Research Centre of Porton Down developed, under the codename Operation Vegetarian, a biological warfare plan intended to collapse the German food chain. The project consisted of manufacturing millions of linseed cake pellets, the usual feed for cattle, impregnated with anthrax spores, and dropping them from the air over the pastures of Germany. The objective was for the cattle to consume them, die from the infection, and for the chain of contagion to spread to the civilian population through the consumption of contaminated meat and milk, generating a food and health crisis capable of accelerating the collapse of the German war effort. The plan was reserved as an option for retaliation, authorized to be activated only if Germany first used chemical or biological weapons against the United Kingdom, or as a resource if the war dragged on longer than expected after the Normandy landings. By 1944, around 5 million of the contaminated cakes had been produced and stored, ready to be loaded onto RAF bombers in case the War Cabinet gave the definitive order for deployment. Tests of the effectiveness of anthrax were carried out on the small Scottish island of Gruinard, which became so contaminated that it remained uninhabited and closed to the public for almost 5 decades, until a decontamination process with formaldehyde diluted in seawater allowed it to be declared safe in 1990. The German surrender in May 1945 made the activation of the plan unnecessary, and the stored cakes were destroyed, according to the available records, by controlled incineration in the years following the conflict. The complete documentation of the project remained classified under the British Official Secrets Act for more than 3 decades and only became publicly known from the 1970s onward. Aspects such as the exact number of cakes finally destroyed, the real deployment protocol planned over German territory, and the degree of approval that the plan came to have at the highest British political level continue not to be completely documented in sources now open to the public. The program formed part of a broader effort of scientific cooperation between the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada in the field of biological warfare, coordinated under different code names during those years, whose complete record of tests, facilities, and stockpiles produced on North American territory remains, to a large extent, still classified or scattered among military archives of the 3 countries, which never centralized a joint and public version of the project. Die Glocke, the secret weapon that perhaps never existed. Since the beginning of the 2000s, mainly from the book by the Polish journalist Igor Witkowski and its later dissemination by the American writer Joseph Farrell, the story has circulated of a supposed secret German project known as Die Glocke, the Bell. According to this version, the SS had developed in an underground complex near the Bystrzyca River in present-day Poland a bell-shaped metallic device that used a rotating mercurial substance called, in these accounts, Zerum 525, capable of generating anti-gravitational effects, or even, according to the most extreme versions, measurable temporal distortions. The account maintains that the project was linked to SS General Hans Kammler, actually responsible for several of the regime's advanced armament programs, including the development of the V-2 rockets, which gave it a certain superficial plausibility by placing it within a command structure that effectively existed and operated similar underground facilities. However, historians specialized in the technical documentation of the Third Reich, who have reviewed patent archives, Ahnenerbe reports, and records of the weapons program known as Wunderwaffe, have found no original document, photograph, or post-war testimony contemporary to the events that mentions a project with those characteristics or that name. The primary source of the story, according to Witkowski himself, was an interrogation of an anonymous Polish officer whose existence could not be independently verified by later researchers, which led numerous academic historians to classify Die Glocke directly as a post-war urban legend without documentary basis, possibly arising from the confusion or exaggeration of real but much less spectacular projects related to electromagnetic research or conventional propulsion of the period. Despite this widespread skepticism in the academic sphere, the story became massively popular through television programs, video games and novels, and continues to be cited in conspiracy theory circles as evidence of hidden Nazi technology never recovered by the Allies, without any declassified archive of the occupying powers having provided, to date, a single document confirming its real existence beyond Witkowski's original account. It is significant that Hans Kammler himself, the real figure around whom much of the legend was built, himself disappeared without leaving a verifiable trace in the final days of the war, feeding with his documentary absence the idea that he may have escaped taking with him technological secrets never confirmed. A real disappearance that ended up functioning, paradoxically, as additional fuel for a myth that the available historical evidence fails to sustain. The Foo Fighters. From late 1944, pilots of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron of the United States Army Air Forces, operating over the Western European front, began to report sightings of small spheres or bright lights, generally orange or reddish in color, that appeared during night missions and moved alongside their planes for several minutes, maintaining distances and speeds that did not correspond to any known conventional interception behavior. The pilots named the phenomenon the Foo Fighters in reference to a nonsense expression taken from a popular comic strip of the time in the United States. The reports, documented in flight logs and intelligence reports from several different units located in different sectors of the front, described objects that did not appear on the radars of Allied aircraft, did not fire or were not fired upon, and suddenly disappeared without leaving any physical trace. In response to the insistence of the reports, the Intelligence Service of the United States Army Air Forces opened an internal investigation during the last months of the war, without achieving a conclusive official explanation, and briefly considered, without later confirmation, the possibility that it was a psychological weapon or an experimental German lighting device intended to disorient Allied crews. A hypothesis that the German documentation captured after the war did not come to support in any technical archive. Later scientific explanations proposed the phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire, a luminous electrical discharge that can occur at the tip of metallic structures during storms or in conditions of high atmospheric static charge, as well as optical reflections generated by particles of unburned fuel expelled by the engines of the Allied aircraft themselves, observed from the cockpit in conditions of total darkness. None of these hypotheses was corroborated with direct physical evidence from the time, and the United States Army itself never issued a unified official conclusion on the origin of the sightings. The term, popularized after the war, even ended up giving its name to a rock band formed decades later, while the original phenomenon remains, in the military archives consulted, officially catalogued as unresolved. One of the most cited reports, recorded in December 1944 near Strasbourg and briefly mentioned by Time magazine in January 1945, described up to 10 of these lights following a group of bombers in formation for almost an hour without any gunner managing to hit them or the pilots reporting a feeling of direct threat beyond the unease generated by the unknown. Luftwaffe units, according to interrogations carried out on German prisoners captured in those months, independently described similar phenomena observed from their own aircraft, which partially ruled out, for Allied analysts, the hypothesis of an exclusively German weapon, since neither side seemed to deliberately control the phenomenon reported by its own pilots. The Battle of Los Angeles. On the night of February 24th to 25th, 1942, barely weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and a few days after a Japanese submarine bombarded oil facilities near Santa Barbara, California, the anti-aircraft defenses of Los Angeles went on maximum alert after detecting, according to the radars of the period, the presence of unidentified objects flying over the city. For several hours, Army batteries fired more than 1,400 anti-aircraft shells into the night sky, while searchlights swept the clouds in search of enemy aircraft, in what the local press described the following day as a direct Japanese attack on continental United States territory. The next morning, no remains of a downed aircraft, no body, no fragment of an enemy aircraft, and no evidence of bombs dropped on the city were found. The only recorded damages, several deaths from heart attacks during the alarm and from traffic accidents in the general blackout, in addition to material destruction caused by the anti-aircraft shrapnel itself as it fell on civilian homes, were a direct consequence of the military response and not of a proven real attack. The Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, publicly declared days later that the whole episode had been the product of a false alarm, attributable to the generalized war nerves after the attack on Pearl Harbor barely 3 months earlier. However, the Army did not fully agree with that naval version, and a later internal report, without ruling out the possibility of stray weather balloons as a possible origin of the initial confusion, also failed to identify with certainty what exactly the anti-aircraft batteries had been firing at for more than an hour, or to explain why multiple observers in different parts of the city coincidentally described a large object moving slowly over the area, apparently resistant to direct hits from the artillery. The lack of a unified technical conclusion between the naval version, which spoke of an alarm without a real target, and that of the Army, which did not rule out a target not identified with certainty, left this episode, popularly known as the Battle of Los Angeles, as one of the most studied cases within the early history of unidentified aerial sightings in the United States. Photographs taken that night and widely reproduced afterward show searchlight beams converging on a fixed point in the sky for several minutes, an image that for decades was used both to support theories about unidentified objects and to illustrate, according to the official interpretation, the erratic behavior of an alarm without a real target behind the lights. The Philadelphia Experiment and the USS Eldridge. The legend of the so-called Philadelphia experiment maintains that in October 1943, the United States Navy allegedly subjected the destroyer escort USS Eldridge to a secret experiment based on a supposed unified field theory developed by Albert Einstein, generating an electromagnetic field capable of making the vessel invisible to radar and, according to the most extreme versions of the account, to the human eye, and even of teleporting it instantly from the port of Philadelphia to Norfolk, Virginia, and back in a matter of minutes. Some versions add crew members who allegedly became fused with metal structures of the ship, or who allegedly suffered partial disappearances as a direct consequence of the experiment. The story originated from anonymous letters sent in 1955 and 1956 by a man identified as Carl Allen, also known as Carlos Miguel Allende, to the researcher and writer on paranormal topics Morris K. Jessup, in which he claimed to have witnessed the experiment from another vessel near the area. Jessup, initially skeptical but intrigued by the level of detail, investigated the case without managing to corroborate any independently verifiable data, and the story gained public notoriety only in the 1970s, when books were published that took up those letters as the main documentary basis. The official records of the United States Navy, including the logbook of the USS Eldridge itself, show that the vessel was in the Atlantic near New York and later in the Caribbean during the dates on which the supposed experiment is placed, with no record whatsoever of its presence in Philadelphia in that exact period, and the surviving crew interviewed in later decades systematically denied having participated in any test of that nature during their active service. Naval historians attribute the origin of the myth to a confusion, deliberate or not, with real but much more mundane experiments carried out during the war, such as hull demagnetization techniques known as degaussing to evade magnetic mines and optical camouflage tests to hinder the visual detection of enemy submarines. Despite the total absence of documentary support and repeated official denials, the Philadelphia experiment remains one of the most persistent legends of naval warfare, replicated in books, films, and television series for decades after its origin. Morris K. Jessup himself, who had popularized Allende's letters, died in 1959 in circumstances officially classified as suicide inside his car, which some followers of the legend interpreted without any evidence to support it. as a silencing related to his investigations, thus adding an additional mystery, this one indeed completely lacking a documentary basis, to a story that already started from unverified sources from its origin. The silenced sinking of the SS Leopoldville. On Christmas Eve 1944, the SS Leopoldville, a Belgian troop transport reconverted for the Allied effort, was crossing the English Channel from England toward Cherbourg with more than 2,200 American soldiers of the 66th Infantry Division who were heading to reinforce the front during the Battle of the Bulge. A few kilometers from its destination, the German submarine U-486 torpedoed it. The impact did not sink the ship immediately, which generated a false sense of security among much of the troop, while the Belgian crew, with little coordination with the American officers and communication difficulties derived in part from the language barrier, failed to organize an orderly evacuation in the critical minutes after the impact. The nearby escort ships were slow to come to the rescue, partly because of radio communication failures and partly because the port of Cherbourg, despite its proximity, did not immediately send enough rescue vessels, supposedly because it was Christmas Eve and had reduced personnel on the docks that night. The Leopoldville finally sank about 2 hours after the impact, and the final death toll, according to records reviewed decades later, exceeded 750 victims, many of them from hypothermia in freezing waters while they waited for a rescue that did not arrive in time. The American Army and the British government classified the incident almost entirely, alleging reasons of troop morale and operational security, and forbade the survivors from speaking publicly about the sinking for years under threat of disciplinary sanction. The consequence was that, for more than 5 decades, the Leopoldville disaster remained practically unknown to the general public. Unlike other naval tragedies of the war of comparable magnitude and much more documented, only in the 90s, after the partial declassification of military archives and the publication of independent investigations based on testimonies from now elderly survivors, was a more complete chronology of the disaster reconstructed. Even so, specific responsibilities, such as why the Belgian crew did not have enough lifeboats in good condition, or why the response from Cherbourg took so long that particular night, were never established with the precision that other, better documented Allied naval disasters of the same war did have. A memorial dedicated to the fallen of the Leopoldville was formally inaugurated in Cherbourg only in 1996, more than 5 decades after the sinking, coinciding with the declassification that allowed the survivors to speak publicly for the first time without restrictions, a notable contrast with the speed with which other Allied disasters of the war received official recognition and public memory. Katyn, the crime that the USSR denied for half a century. In the spring of 1940, the Soviet secret police, NKVD, systematically executed some 22,000 Polish citizens, mostly army officers, police officers, officials, and members of the intelligentsia captured after the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in 1939. The executions, carried out by shots to the back of the neck, took place at different points, among them the Katyn forest near Smolensk, and the bodies were buried in mass graves that remained hidden for years. In 1943, German troops occupying the region announced the discovery of the Katyn graves and publicly accused the Soviet Union of the massacre in a propaganda campaign intended to fracture the alliance between the Soviets and the Western governments in the middle of the war. The Soviet Union denied any responsibility and, in turn, accused Germany of having committed the executions after occupying the area in 1941. Allied governments, mainly the United States and the United Kingdom, knew through their own intelligence reports of solid indications of Soviet responsibility, but chose, for reasons of strategic necessity in the middle of the war against Germany, not to publicly question Moscow's version, their indispensable military partner on the Eastern Front. That stance remained practically intact throughout the Cold War. The Soviet Union officially maintained German guilt until 1990, when, under the government of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Kremlin acknowledged for the first time the direct responsibility of the NKVD, and in 1992 Russia handed over to Poland documentation that included the original order signed by Stalin and other members of the Politburo, authorizing the mass executions of Polish officers. Despite that acknowledgement, complete archives on the operation, including the exact location of some additional graves and the names of all the victims, were not handed over in their entirety, and Russia classified part of the judicial investigation into Katyn again in 2004, alleging reasons of national security. Polish organizations and relatives of victims continue to demand, to this day, full access to those files, which keeps partially open in its documentary dimension, although no longer in its established authorship, one of the most prolonged cover-ups of the war. The Polish Red Cross and a team of forensic experts from 12 countries, convened by Germany in 1943 partly for propaganda purposes, had then documented a large part of the graves through detailed autopsies, reports that the Soviet Union itself attempted to discredit after the war by alleging Nazi manipulation of the evidence, a strategy that further delayed official recognition decades after those same reports proved, in their central forensic aspects, to be substantially correct. The final number of victims itself continues to be subject to adjustment among Polish and Russian historians, who work from partially different lists depending on the regional archive consulted, a minor discrepancy in relative terms, but one that illustrates the extent to which the Soviet documentation on the operation was never handed over in a complete or unified manner to the Polish authorities that still today demand full access to those records. Unit 731, the archives the United States bought. During the Japanese occupation of Manchuria, Unit 731, led by the military doctor Shiro Ishii from its main headquarters in Pingfang near Harbin, carried out between 1937 and 1945 an extensive program of experimentation with biological and chemical weapons on human beings, using Chinese, Soviet, Korean prisoners and, to a lesser extent, captured Western allies. The victims, referred to internally as maruta, logs of wood, were subjected to deliberate infections with plague, cholera, anthrax, and other pathogens, vivisections without anesthesia, experimental freezing of extremities, and field biological weapons tests in figures that different academic estimates place between 3,000 and 12,000 direct deaths, not counting the later victims of attacks with biological weapons developed from those studies in different regions of China. At the end of the war, much of the documentation and many of those responsible for the unit avoided being prosecuted in the Tokyo trials. American investigators, aware of the scientific value, obtained criminally of the data on the effects of biological weapons on humans, negotiated in 1947 and 1948 with Ishii and other key officers an agreement of judicial immunity in exchange for full access to their research archives within the broader framework of the nascent Cold War and the American interest in developing its own biological defense program before the Soviet Union. That agreement remained officially denied by the American government for decades, until historians accessed documents declassified from the 80s onward that confirmed both the existence of the pact and the transfer of technical reports to research facilities in the United States. However, substantial parts of the original Unit 731 archive, including detailed medical records of the victims and complete experimental protocols, were never made public in their entirety, either because they remain classified because they were deliberately destroyed by the Japanese themselves before the surrender to avoid incriminating evidence, or because they were lost during their transfer. The exact number of victims, the complete list of identities, and the final fate of much of that documentation remain without being definitively reconstructed up to the present. Several researchers who participated in the unit's experiments rejoined post-war Japanese professional life without sanction, and some later held relevant positions in the country's pharmaceutical and medical industry, a continuity that Japanese and foreign historians consider a direct, although uncomfortable, consequence of the immunity pact signed with the United States in the 40s. The Ahnenerbe and the Nazi search in Tibet. In 1938, the SS research institute known as Ahnenerbe, founded by Heinrich Himmler to scientifically support the racial theories of Nazism, organized an expedition to Tibet led by the young zoologist Ernst Schaefer. The team, also made up of anthropologists and film technicians, spent several months in the region collecting fauna specimens, carrying out cranial and anthropometric measurements on the local population, and filming documentary material with the declared objective of providing evidence for Himmler's theories about a common Aryan origin between peoples of the Himalayas and the European Nordic races. The official records of the expedition, today preserved in German archives, document fieldwork that was relatively conventional by the deeply racist but methodologically orthodox standards of physical anthropology of the time, with no mention whatsoever of the search for esoteric artifacts, lost cities, or the Holy Grail, elements that do appear recurrently in sensationalist books and documentaries published decades later, which combined this real journey with Himmler's personal interests in occultism, Germanic esotericism, and legends such as that of Shambhala, a mythical Buddhist kingdom that some European esoteric circles of the early 20th century mistakenly associated with a supposed lost Aryan origin. Historians who have studied the Ahnenerbe archives in depth agree that there is no documentation supporting a mission to search for supernatural objects, and attribute the persistence of the myth to the combination of Himmler's personal and verifiable interest in occultism, which led him to finance within his institute studies on astrology and dowsing, and the later cultural curiosity to find a more spectacular explanation for the real motivations of the Nazi regime. What does remain as a genuinely less documented area is the final destination of much of the anthropological and photographic material collected during the journey, scattered after the war among different European archives without unified cataloguing, and the exact influence that this material had on the racial policies later applied by the regime. A link that historians can only reconstruct partially and indirectly from secondary sources. Schaefer's team came to measure several hundred local inhabitants anthropometrically and to take facial casts for comparative purposes, material now considered deeply questionable from the standpoint of contemporary scientific ethics, partially preserved in German anthropological archives and still the subject of debate over its eventual restitution or definitive museum destination. The Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, famous for his previous Asian journeys, collaborated indirectly in the organization of the trip, although he always maintained public distance from the racial theories that motivated Himmler. Patton's death, accident or something more? On December 9, 1945, with the war already over and in the midst of the Allied occupation period of Germany, General George S. Patton was traveling as a passenger in an official automobile near Mannheim when it collided at low speed with an American military truck. The impact, apparently minor for the other occupants of the vehicle, caused Patton, seated in the front seat without protection, to strike his head violently against the windshield, fracturing his neck and becoming immediately paralyzed from the neck down. He remained hospitalized in Heidelberg for 12 days, with his mind lucid but his body immobilized, until dying on December 21, 1945, because of a clot that caused him a sudden cardiac arrest. Patton had been, during the months prior to the accident, an increasingly uncomfortable figure for the Allied High Command because of his public statements against denazification as it was being applied, his open hostility toward the Soviet Union, and his comments about the advisability of continuing the war against the Soviets while the Allied army was still mobilized in Europe, positions that generated serious tensions with Eisenhower and with official American policy in the recent post-war period. That political friction fueled, from shortly after his death, theories that suggested a murder concealed as a fortuitous accident. The most widely circulated version comes from a book published in 1979 by the journalist Robert Wilcox, which gathers the supposed confession, attributed to a former agent of the Office of Strategic Services named Douglas Bazata, who supposedly declared decades later that he had organized the crash on commission, and that a Soviet agent had later poisoned Patton during his hospitalization to ensure his definitive death. None of these claims achieved independent documentary support. The available medical records are compatible with a death from complications of an accidental trauma, and the driver of the truck involved, identified as Private Robert L. Thompson, was never investigated beyond the usual administrative procedure of the period. The combination of a sudden death, a tense political context, and a late confession without independent verification keeps the theory alive among certain sectors, although without evidence supporting it beyond the account of a single source never corroborated by additional documentation. Eisenhower himself, in private correspondence written shortly after the accident, described the news as deeply unexpected. without expressing in those letters any suspicion of irregularity, a detail that historians commonly cite to contrast the institutional coldness of the moment with the intensity that the assassination theory acquired only decades later. Why the Allies did not bomb Auschwitz. From 1944 onward, Allied intelligence had increasingly precise information about the functioning of the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex. Aerial photographs taken incidentally by reconnaissance aircraft flying over the area on missions aimed at nearby industrial factories captured, without being analyzed for that purpose at the time, columns of prisoners and clearly visible camp structures. Added to this, in the middle of that year, was the detailed report prepared by Rudolf Werber and Alfred Wetzler, two prisoners who had managed to escape from the camp, precisely describing the functioning of the gas chambers and crematoria for the Allied authorities. Jewish organizations, among them the World Jewish Congress and representatives of Hungarian communities, formally requested the United States War Department and the British Royal Air Force to bomb the railway lines leading to the camp, or directly the extermination facilities, as a way to slow the mass deportations of Hungarian Jews that were intensifying in that period. The United States Under-Secretary of War John McCloy responded in an official communication in August 1944 that the requested operation would divert air resources considered essential for other decisive operations underway at that moment of the war, and that its technical feasibility was doubtful given the distance from the Allied bases then available. Later historians have extensively debated that justification, pointing out that Allied bombers flew over and attacked industrial facilities located a few kilometers from the camp itself in those same weeks, which would indicate that distance was not an insurmountable technical obstacle as was argued. Other historians argue that a precision bombing of the railway lines would have had limited effects, since these could be repaired in a few days with forced labor, and that directly attacking the gas chambers would have killed a significant number of the prisoners themselves, with no guarantee of stopping the genocide underway beyond the immediate effect. It has not been possible to establish with documentary certainty to what extent the decision responded strictly to a rational military calculation, to a real lack of knowledge of the scale of the extermination underway, or to a lack of political priority in the face of the suffering of the European Jewish population, and the available archives on the internal deliberations of that summer remain, as the historians themselves who have consulted them in depth acknowledge, incomplete at key points in the chain of decision. Winston Churchill, after learning in July 1944 of the reports on the extermination underway, wrote to his Secretary of Foreign Affairs that any available means should be used to stop it, an instruction that, as the available British archives show, ultimately did not translate into a concrete operational bombing order, without the documents known to this day explaining precisely at what point in the chain of command that initial intention was diluted. The Malmedy Massacre. On December 17, 1944, during the first hours of the German offensive in the Ardennes, a combat group of the 1st SS Panzer Division, commanded by Colonel Joachim Peiper, intercepted near the Bonnier Crossroads, close to the Belgian town of Malmedy, a column of Battery B of the American 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. After a brief exchange of fire, the American soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, surrendered. Shortly afterward, according to the testimony of the survivors, German troops opened fire with machine guns on the group of unarmed prisoners gathered in an open field, killing about 84 men in a matter of minutes. After the end of the war, an American military tribunal carried out the Dachau trial in 1946, in which 73 members of Peiper's unit were accused of the massacre and of other crimes committed during the Ardennes offensive. 43 received death sentences and the rest prison terms, including Peiper himself, sentenced to the gallows. However, from 1948 onward, allegations began to circulate that American interrogators had obtained much of the confessions through coercive methods, including mock executions, sleep deprivation, and beatings, which led to an internal review by the Army and, in 1949, to a Senate investigation led by a committee in which then-Senator Joseph McCarthy actively participated. The political pressure derived from those allegations led to none of the death sentences ultimately being carried out, and Peiper, together with the rest of the convicted men, saw their sentences commuted and was released in 1956. more than a decade earlier than his original sentences had provided. The controversy left two questions unresolved in a unanimous way among historians: whether the original massacre was a deliberate order from the German chain of command or the result of a chaotic situation that escalated without explicit control in the midst of combat, and to what extent the real irregularities in the subsequent judicial process, also used by defenders of the convicted men to question the legitimacy of the trial as a whole, ended up unduly benefiting those responsible for a war crime whose execution, according to most of the available testimonial evidence, was indeed intentional from the first shot. Joachim Peiper, who after serving part of his sentence settled under his real name in the French town of Treves, died in July 1976 when his home was set on fire during the night, allegedly by former members of the French resistance who had identified his past. The case was never judicially resolved, and no responsible person was identified or tried, so that the officer in command of the Malmedy massacre ended, 30 years later, as the victim of a crime as unresolved as the one he himself had led.